See you in the next life, my daughter-in-law whispered, the heavy thud of the deadbolt sealing my fate inside the sinking hull. My son Michael didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't even look away. He just stood on the deck and watched his inheritance sink into the black Atlantic. They thought 40 years of building an empire could be erased by a few feet of water, but they forgot that steel doesn't break, it just gets colder. If you're listening to this, hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. It helps to know I'm not shouting into the void like I was that night. Because what they didn't know is that you can't drown a man who knows how to hold his breath. And the look on their faces when I walked into my own funeral was worth every second of freezing hell. The Atlantic Ocean wasn't just water that night. It was a vast, breathing beast, a prehistoric entity of rhythmic, low-frequency groans waiting to swallow something whole. Under the silver-white glare of a harvest moon, the surface looked like a sheet of hammered copper, beautiful, cold, and utterly indifferent to the lives floating upon it. I stood on the aft deck of the ironclad, feeling the vibration of the twin diesels through the soles of my deck shoes. She was 60 feet of steel and stubbornness, an expedition trawler I had spent 3 years restoring with my own 2 hands. I knew every bolt, every weld, and every unique vibration of her hull. To me, a ship was like a building. It was a study in loads and balances. If you knew where the tension was, you knew when it would snap. I wasn't a man who bought shiny plastic toys. I was Arthur Vance. For 40 years, I had built Vance Logistics from a single rusted delivery truck into a multi-state empire. I moved freight. I built warehouses designed to survive Category 5 hurricanes. I fixed engines when they broke, and I fired men when they stole. I understood the world through the lens of mechanics, leverage, and gravity. These were honest laws. They didn't lie. But looking at my son Michael sitting across from me, I realized I was looking at a structure I hadn't designed, and one I didn't understand at all. The realization made the freezing sea air feel warm by comparison. Michael sat at the teak table, his fingers dancing a frantic, rhythmic ritual with his wedding ring. Round and round. It was a nervous tick I hadn't seen since he was 10 years old, sitting in my study, waiting for a report card he knew was full of red ink. He was 35 now, but he had the posture of a tired old man. He had grown soft in the middle, the kind of softness that comes from expensive lunches and a lack of physical labor. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first warehouse down payment. It looked soft, expensive, and completely useless against the biting Atlantic wind. He looked at the floor, he looked at the polished railing, he looked at the condensation on the wine glass in front of him. He looked everywhere but at the man who had given him everything. Across from him sat Jessica, my daughter-in-law. If Michael was soft clay, Jessica was the kiln that had fired him into something sharp and brittle. She was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a jagged piece of obsidian, sharp, dangerous, and dark. Her cheekbones were high and prominent enough to cut glass, and her eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely devoid of warmth. Years ago, when Michael first brought her home, I had mistaken her hunger for ambition. I saw the way she looked at my ledgers and thought she wanted to build things, like I did. I saw the way she looked at my ledgers and thought she wanted to build things, like I did. I thought she had grit. I thought she was the steel Michael lacked. Now, staring at her under the cold moonlight, I finally saw her clearly. She wasn't a builder, she was a void, a black hole that consumed everything it touched, money, status, people, and demanded more to fill the emptiness. "The champagne is flat," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the hum of the engines. She pushed her crystal flute away with a slow, deliberate motion. Her voice was tight, vibrating like a piano wire pulled to the absolute breaking point. She didn't look at the ocean. She looked at me with a gaze that felt like an audit. "Are we going to talk about it, Arthur? Or are we just going to stare at the waves and pretend we're a happy family on a midnight cruise?" I leaned back against the railing. The steel was cold through my jacket, a solid, grounding presence. I swirled the melting ice in my scotch, listening to the rhythmic clink-clink of the cubes against the glass. It was the only sound for a long moment. "We're going to talk," I said. My voice was low, calm. It was the voice I used during union strikes when the air was thick with the threat of violence. It was the voice that ended arguments before they began because it left no room for negotiation. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid. It burned pleasantly, a small fire against the damp chill of the night. "You asked for $5 million, I said, laying the number out on the table like a heavy tool. "For the investment you mentioned, the condo development in Miami, the Grand Vista." Michael's head snapped up. A flash of hope ignited in his eyes, a desperate, pathetic hope that ignored the reality of the situation. "It's a sure thing, Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "The pre-sales are through the roof. We've already got international buyers lining up. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. If we don't close the gap now, we lose the land. The pre-sales are fake, Michael." I didn't shout. I didn't have to. In my world, the truth was always loud enough. "I made some calls yesterday," I continued, watching the color drain from his face. "The developer is already under a sealed indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement. If I give you that money, it doesn't go into a building. It vanishes." Poof! I snapped my fingers. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet of the deck. "Just like the money I gave you for the restaurant that never opened. Just like the capital for the art gallery that went bankrupt in 6 months. Michael froze. His mouth opened as if to offer a defense, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just realized the bridge he was standing on had no supports. "It's different this time, Dad. You're not listening." Michael's voice rose to a shrill pitch that set my teeth on edge. He stood up so abruptly that his heavy teak chair screeched against the deck before toppling backward. The clatter of wood on steel echoed across the open water, a discordant note in the night's symphony. He didn't bother to pick it up. He paced the small area of the aft deck, his hands buried in his hair, pulling at the roots. "We're in deep. You don't understand the mechanics of this. It's not just a bank loan we can restructure. It's not a line of credit I can just walk away from." He stopped and wiped a sheen of oily sweat from his forehead, despite the freezing spray of the Atlantic mist. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a primal, animalistic terror. "There are people involved, Dad. Private lenders. They aren't the kind of people who send registered letters or file for arbitration. They don't care about the law." I stared at him, my heart feeling like a lead weight in my chest. I had spent 40 years building a name that stood for reliability and strength, and here was my only heir, trembling over a debt to monsters. "Loan sharks," I corrected him, my voice flat and cold. "Let's use the right terminology, Michael. You didn't find investors. You found predators. You borrowed from sharks to pay for a lifestyle you didn't earn, to fuel dreams you didn't have the discipline to build." "They're investors," he cried, his voice breaking into a sob. "They're sharks," I repeated, stepping toward him. "And the problem with sharks, Michael, is that they don't care about the Miami project. They only care about the scent of blood. And right now, you're bleeding out. We deserve a life." Jessica snapped. She didn't rise slowly. She stood with the sudden lethal grace of a viper. She didn't look scared like Michael. She looked furious, a cold, calculated rage that made her eyes glitter like ice under the moonlight. She stepped closer to me, invading my personal space. Her perfume was expensive, floral, and suddenly overpowering, masking the honest smell of salt and diesel. "You sit on that trust fund like a dragon on a mountain of gold, Arthur," she hissed. The piano wire tension in her voice had finally snapped. "You're 70 years old. You've had your time. You've built your empire. You have millions, tens of millions, rotting in accounts, gathering dust while we're suffocating." She gestured vaguely toward the horizon, toward the life she felt entitled to. "When do we get our turn? When do we get to breathe? Are you waiting until you're dead and buried? Is that the only way we get to live?" The question hung in the salty air, naked and ugly. It was the fundamental rot at the center of their marriage, the silent prayer they likely whispered every time I coughed or looked tired. I looked her directly in the eye, refusing to blink, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "You get your turn when you learn to build something," I said, my voice echoing with the authority of the man who had laid 1,000 foundations. "Ownership isn't a birthright, Jessica. It's a responsibility. And so far you've shown me you can only destroy." I set my scotch glass down on the railing with a deliberate clack. I crossed my arms over my chest, the heavy canvas of my jacket, a suit of armor. "I'm not bailing you out," I said. "Not this time. Not ever again. I've spent my life ensuring the Vance name meant something. I won't let you turn it into a punchline for the SEC. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. "I'm freezing the monthly stipend, effective tomorrow morning, and I've already instructed my attorneys to move the majority of the company's shares into a charitable trust. It stays there out of your reach until you can prove through 5 years of sobriety and steady employment that you are responsible enough to manage even a fraction of it." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a calm sea. It was heavy, pressurized, the silence of a bridge's main cable snapping, that split second of weightlessness before the entire structure collapses into the gorge. Jessica looked at Michael. For a moment she didn't look like his wife. She looked like his commander. A look passed between them, a silent, terrifying agreement that had clearly been rehearsed in the dark corners of their home. "I told you," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to Michael. "I told you he wouldn't help. He's too proud. He loves his legacy more than he loves his own blood." "Michael?" I asked, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather creeping up my spine. "What is she talking about?" Jessica moved. She didn't lunge. She flowed with a terrifying, predatory smoothness. She walked past me toward the heavy, watertight steel door that led to the lower crew cabins and the engine access. "We prepared for this eventuality, Arthur," she said, her voice now conversational, almost pleasant. "We hoped it wouldn't come to this. Truly, we hoped you'd be reasonable." She reached inside the doorframe. I knew exactly what was behind that panel. It was the heart of the ship's safety systems. "The insurance on the ironclad is quite substantial," she remarked, her hand hovering over the controls. She didn't pull the red handle, the emergency fire suppression. She pulled the black one. Thunk! The sound didn't just vibrate through the hull. It vibrated through the marrow of my bones. It was a deep, resonant, metallic clunk. The sound of a hammer hitting a coffin lid. I knew that sound. It was the manual override for the Seacock. The massive intake valves, designed to draw in seawater for cooling and ballast, had been slammed wide open, but with the pumps disabled, they weren't cooling anything. They were letting the Atlantic inside. "What did you do?" I took a sharp step toward her, my mind racing through the schematics of the boat. "The bilge pumps are disabled, Arthur," Jessica said. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "I pulled the fuses an hour ago while you were showing Michael the beauty of the star. The boat is taking on water, and because of the modifications you made for the reinforced hull, she's going to settle fast." The deck beneath my feet felt different. The vibration of the engines changed pitch, straining against the sudden weight of the water filling the bilge. "You're insane," I said, the gravity of the betrayal finally hitting me. "You're on the boat. We're 10 miles out. The dinghy is prepped," she said, pointing a manicured finger toward the darkness off the stern. I looked. The small, high-powered Zodiac dinghy was already bobbing in the wake. The engine lowered, the tether line taut. It was stocked. It was ready. "We're leaving, Arthur," she said, a small, dark smile playing on her lips. "You're staying." A tragic accent. An old man, distraught over his failing health and his failing company, takes his beloved boat out one last time and forgets to check the valves. It's a story the papers will love. "Michael," my voice wasn't just a shout. It was a command, the sound of a foundation cracking under an impossible load. "Do you hear her? She's sinking the boat. Help me close the valves. We can still save her." I looked at my son, pleading with my eyes for some spark of the man I thought I had raised. He was standing by the teak railing, his knuckles white. Tears were streaming down his face, carving tracks through the salt spray on his cheeks. He looked like a child lost in a supermarket, paralyzed by a world that had suddenly become too big and too cruel. I can't, Dad," he whispered. His voice was a thin, pathetic reed. "It's too late. It's already done." Jessica didn't give him time to waver. She stepped through the heavy steel door that led the companionway, pulling it half shut to create a physical barrier between my world and theirs. She looked at Michael with eyes that were hard, demanding, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Get in the boat, Michael," she commanded. It wasn't a request, it was the final instruction to a tool she had spent years sharpening for this exact moment. I lunged. My boots skidded on the wet teak as I threw my weight toward the door. I was 70, but I was built of the same stubborn steel as my ship. I intended to go through her, to get to those valves, to save the legacy that was currently gurgling into the bilge. Jessica slammed the door. I hit the reinforced steel with my lead shoulder. The impact sent a white-hot spike of pain shooting down my arm, a reminder that my frame was more brittle than it used to be. I bounced off, stumbling back against the opposite bulkhead. Click-clack, the sound of the heavy mechanical wheels spinning, the sound of the deadbolt engaging. It was the finality of a judge's gavel. I was locked in the aft crew quarters, a steel box with one way out, and that way was now a sealed barrier designed to withstand the very pressure that was currently building beneath my feet. "Open it," I screamed, my voice muffled by the thickness of the hull. I pounded on the small, reinforced porthole with my fist. The glass was 3 inches thick, meant to survive the crushing depths of the North Atlantic. My knuckles bled, leaving red smears on the clear surface. I could see them through the glass. It was like watching a silent film of my own execution. Jessica was dragging Michael toward the swim platform. He was stumbling, looking back over his shoulder at the window where his father's face was pressed. "Michael, son, look at me." Michael stopped for one agonizing, eternal second. Our eyes locked through the thick glass. In that heartbeat, I looked for the boy I had taught to fish in the Chesapeake Bay. I looked for the teenager I had watched build his first engine. I looked for the man I had hoped would one day carry the Vance name with honor. I saw none of them. My son's eyes were hollow, dead things. He saw his father trapped in a steel box that was filling with the ocean, and he didn't reach out. He didn't scream. He didn't fight back against the woman pulling his arm. He just stared. It was a look of pathetic resignation, the look of a structure that had reached its point of total failure. He had chosen his master, and it wasn't the man who had given him life. "No one will ever find you, Arthur." Jessica's voice came through the glass. It was muffled by the steel, but the malice carried through perfectly. The ocean is very good at keeping secrets. It's a tragedy, a mechanical failure on an old, poorly maintained vessel. "Goodbye, Arthur. Thank you for the life you're about to give us." They disappeared over the edge. A moment later, I heard the high-pitched whine of the Zodiac's outboard motor. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the wind and the rhythmic groaning of the ironclad. I was alone, and then I felt it, the subtle shift in the center of gravity. The floor began to tilt, a slow, sickening incline toward the stern. The panic hit me then, not as a thought, but as a physical blow to the solar plexus. A cold, sharp spike in the chest that made it hard to draw breath. I was locked in the crew quarters. The room was barely 8 by 10 feet. 2 bunks, small head, and a watertight door leading to the engine room. And from behind that door, I heard it. A roar. It sounded like a beast waking up in the bowels of the ship. It was the sound of thousands of gallons of seawater rushing through the intake valves, swirling around the massive diesel engines, and rising. The hydrostatic pressure was building. I could hear the metal straining, the rivets popping like distant firecrackers as the weight of the Atlantic began to drag 60 feet of steel toward the bottom. The ironclad was heavy. She wouldn't capsize immediately. She was built for stability. She would settle stern first, the heavy engines acting as an anchor, and then she would slide backward into the dark. I checked my watch, 12:04 a.m. I did the math in my head, the way I had done for 1,000 construction bids. Based on the diameter of the intake pipes and the current list of the boat, I had maybe 20 minutes before the water level reached the electrical systems and the lights went out. 20 minutes before the air became a luxury. "Breathe," I told myself, my voice a raspy growl in the small room. "You are Arthur Vance. You solve problems. You evaluate the load. You find the weakness and you apply leverage." I waded to the lower bunk. The water was already seeping under the engine room door, black and oily. It reached my ankles, and the temperature was a shock. A freezing, numbing bite that promised to sap the heat from my body in minutes. The Atlantic in November didn't just drown you, it froze your heart in its tracks. I ripped the mattress off the bunk, throwing it into the rising black water. I checked the storage locker underneath. Empty, no tools, no crowbar. I slammed my fist against the bulkhead in a moment of pure, unadulterated rage. "Think," my eyes scanned the ceiling, tracing the lines of the ship's internal organs. And then I saw it, the ventilation. The ironclad had a forced air system for the crew quarters to prevent the buildup of diesel fumes. The rectangular duct ran along the ceiling, hidden behind plastic louvers, leading to the exhaust vents on the upper flybridge. It was my only chance, my only exit, and it was 18 inches wide. The water was at my knees now, and the list of the ship had increased to a precarious 15 degrees. Every few seconds, the hull would let out a low, metallic groan, the sound of structural steel twisting under a load it was never meant to bear. I looked up at the ventilation grate. In any other situation, I would have analyzed the CFM cubic feet per minute airflow. Now I was analyzing it as a coffin lid. I grabbed the heavy metal ladder from the bunk beds. My hands were slick with oily water, and my grip was failing as the cold began to numb my motor skills. I swung the ladder with a grunt of primal effort. Crash! The plastic louvers shattered, raining sharp, white shards down into the black water. The opening was revealed, rectangular throat of galvanized sheet metal, barely 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep. It was a passage designed for air, not for a man built of muscle and decades of heavy lifting. I reached up, feeling the rim. It was secured to the steel deckhead with heavy-duty marine screws. Grade 316, stainless steel, meant to resist corrosion. I didn't have a screwdriver. I didn't have a pry bar. I reached into my pocket, my fingers fumbling against the sodden fabric of my trousers. My keys, attached to the ring, was a small, high-end multi-tool, a Father's Day gift from Michael 5 years ago. My hands were shaking, a combination of stage 1 hypothermia and the adrenaline dumping into my system. I unfolded the small Phillips head bit. It felt like a toy in my calloused hands. I reached up, bracing my shoulder against the upper bunk as the boat lurched violently to port. The water was at my waist now, a freezing shroud that seemed to pull at my very soul. I set the tool into the first screw and twisted. Creak! The metal groaned, but it held. I applied more torque, my muscles screaming. The tool slipped. I heard the sickening sound of metal grinding against metal. The screw head was stripped. It was now a useless, smooth crater. No, I growled, the word vibrating in my chest. Not like this. I did not build an empire to be drowned by a 10-cent piece of hardware. I moved to the second screw, then the third. I worked with the frantic precision of a man who knew the exact density of the medium that was about to claim him. The boat gave another shudder, a deep-seated pop echoing from the engine room. As a bulkhead finally failed, the water surged, rising to my chest in a sudden, cold wave. I went under. The taste was a foul cocktail of salt, diesel, and rust. I kicked off the bunk, breaking the surface and gasping for air that was becoming increasingly thin. I didn't focus on the cold. I focused on the fourth screw. I jammed the tool in, turned with every ounce of rage I possessed, and felt the bite. The screw turned. Then the next. The grate gave way, falling into the rising tide with a heavy splash. I hauled myself up. My shoulders hit the edges of the duct. I am a broad man, a man of substantial frame, as my doctor likes to say. The sheet metal bit into my skin, slicing through my shirt and carving shallow red lines into my deltoids. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the friction. I squeezed, I exhaled, collapsing my rib cage, and shoved my way into the dark. It was pitch black inside the duct. The air was thick with the smell of decades-old dust, grease, and the faint metallic tang of the ventilation fan's motor. The roar of the water below was deafening now. It sounded like the ocean was chewing the ironclad into pieces, one rivet at a time. I crawled upward, my back pressed against one side of the duct, my feet against the other. It was a vertical chimney of slick metal. Every inch was a battle against gravity and the ship's increasing tilt. I reached the elbow joint, a 90-degree turn that led to the deck vent. My lungs were burning, the air inside the duct stagnant and hot compared to the freezing water below. I looked up. Tiny, perfect square of moonlight flickered at the end of the tunnel. It looked like heaven, but there was a shadow in the way. The exhaust fan. I pushed against the circular housing with my hand. It didn't budge. The blades were seized, rusted solid by years of salt air. It was a circular cage of steel mesh and aluminum blades, bolted directly into the fiberglass of the flybridge. Move, I hissed, shoving against it. Nothing. Behind me I heard a new sound, a gurgling, rushing hiss. The water had reached the ventilation intake and the crew quarters. It was coming up the duct after me, a black piston of hydraulic force. I had no room to swing a fist. I had no leverage for my arms. I braced my back against the elbow of the duct. I pulled my knees to my chest. My boots find a grip on the inner rim of the fan housing. I thought of Michael's dead eyes. I thought of Jessica's predatory smile. I thought of 40 years of sweat and blood poured into a company they were currently dismantling in their heads. I channeled every ounce of that betrayal, every newton of force my legs could muster, and I kicked cracked. Fiberglass rims shattered. The fan housing tore free, tumbling outward and clattering onto the deck. I scrambled out, gasping, my hands clawing at the jagged edges of the vent. I rolled onto the wet deck of the flybridge, my chest heaving, the cold wind hitting my soaked body like a physical lash. I looked down. The ironclad was in her death throes. The stern was completely submerged, the white foam of the Atlantic churning over the teak decks I had polished by hand. The bow was pointing at the stars, a lone finger of steel accusing the sky. The boat was groaning, a terrible organic sound of twisting metal and popping rivets. I looked out at the horizon about a mile away. I saw the steady white light of the Zodiac's motor, a small spark of life moving toward the distant coast of Georgia. They hadn't even looked back. To them I was already a ghost. The boat gave a sudden, violent shudder. The air trapped in the forward cabins blew out the portholes with the sound of a cannon shot. She was sliding under. I knew the physics of a sinking ship. I knew the suction. The vortex created as 40 tons of steel displaces a massive volume of water. If I stayed on the boat, I'd be dragged 100 feet down before I could even take a breath. I grabbed a life ring from the railing, a bright orange circle of buoyancy. I didn't jump off the high side. I ran toward the bow, which was now 30 feet in the air. As the boat began its final rapid slide backward into the abyss, I stepped off into the black. The shock of the water was instant. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing every inch of my skin simultaneously. The cold was so intense it felt hot. A searing, numbing fire that threatened to stop my heart on the first beat. I swam. I swam with a desperation I didn't know I still possessed. I kicked until my thighs burned, pulling the life ring with me. I felt the tug of the ship behind me, a rhythmic, pulsing pull as the ocean rushed in to fill the void. The ironclad was leaving behind. I didn't look back until the pulling stopped. When I finally turned, the ocean was flat. The moon was still shining, the copper light dancing on the ripples. The ironclad was gone. My legacy, my history, my home, all at the bottom of a 400-foot trench. I drifted in the silence, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they would shatter. My limbs were becoming heavy, the hypothermia beginning its slow, seductive lullaby. "I'm not done," I whispered, the words barely a breath. I gripped the life ring until my frozen fingers locked into place. "I'm not done." I washed up on the jagged edge of a barrier island at dawn. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple, gray, and swollen with the coming rain. I was half frozen, my skin a deathly shade of blue-white, and my muscles felt like they had been replaced with rusted iron. Every movement was a negotiation with agony, but as my boots crunched on the frozen sand, I felt a spark of something hotter than the sun, a cold, crystalline clarity. I found a summer cottage nestled in the dunes, boarded up for the winter. It was a sprawling Victorian, its windows like blind eyes. I didn't hesitate. I found a heavy, salt-pitted rock and shattered a basement window. The sound of breaking glass was the first note in the symphony of my return. I crawled inside. The house smelled of mothballs, cedar, and the eerie stillness of a place that had been put to sleep. I stayed there for 2 days. I found old oversized wool sweaters in a cedar chest and moth-eaten sweatpants. I looked in the mirror for the first time. I saw a bearded, haggard stranger with eyes that looked like they had seen the bottom of the Atlantic. 'Cause they had. I survived on cold tomato soup from a pantry, eating it directly from the can with a rusted spoon, the metallic tang of the tin mixed with the salt still in my throat. I had time to think. I sat in a dusty armchair, watching the dust motes dance in the slivers of light, and I mapped out the structural failure of my family. My first instinct, the instinct of an honest man, was to go to the police, but I stopped myself. I was a builder. I knew about evidence. What did I have? The boat was 400 feet down. Jessica was a surgical planner. She would have wiped the cloud servers and the onboard DVR. She would have a story prepared. I was drunk. I was grieving. I was senile. It would be my word against the grieving widow and the tragic heir. No, Justice required more than an arrest. It required the total, structural collapse of their reality. I left the island on a stolen kayak, paddling 3 miles to the mainland under a moonless sky. My arms were leaden. My heart was a stuttering engine. But the rage fueled me. I didn't go home. I went to the one place I knew the load would hold. Frank, the tank miller, lived in a small row house in the old Irish district. He was my first foreman, the man who stood beside me when we only had one truck and a dream. Frank was the kind of man who understood that sometimes, to save a building, you had to burn the rot out of the walls. I knocked on his back door at 3:00 a.m. Frank opened it, holding a seasoned hickory baseball bat. He was 72, wearing a faded bathrobe, but his eyes were still the eyes of a man you didn't cross. When he saw me wet, bearded, wearing stolen, oversized clothes, he dropped the bat. It hit the linoleum with a heavy thud. "Boss," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The news," they said. The Coast Guard called off the search. "They're planning the funeral for Friday. I'm hard to kill, Frank." I rasped, my throat raw from the salt. I stepped into the warmth of his kitchen, and the heat almost made me collapse. "Let me in, we have work to do." And Frank, as far as the world is concerned, I'm still at the bottom of the sea. For the next week, Frank's wood-paneled basement became my command center. We bought burner phones and high-end laptops with the cash Frank kept in his floor safe, his retirement insurance. "You look like hell, Arthur," Frank said, handing me a mug of black coffee that was strong enough to strip paint. "I feel like it," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "But I need eyes on them, Frank. I need to see the termites at work." I had designed the security infrastructure of my own home. I knew the backdoor codes to the server that Jessica hadn't thought to check. She was arrogant. She assumed that because I was 70, I didn't understand the cloud. She thought dead men didn't log in. I became a ghost in my own life. I watched the high-definition feeds of my study, my living room, my kitchen. It was like watching a movie of a house haunted by the living. I saw Jessica sitting at my desk, my mahogany desk. The very next morning, she wasn't wearing black. She was wearing a cream-colored power suit, sipping espresso. She was on the phone, her voice a sharp clinical blade. "Yes, liquidate the entire bond portfolio," she said, spinning my leather executive chair. The chair I'd sat in for 30 years, back and forth with a playful flick of her heel. "I don't care about the early withdrawal penalties. We need the liquid cash for the Miami close-out. The Grand Vista waits for no one." She hung up and smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief. It was a smile of pure predatory satisfaction. She picked up a framed photo of me from the desk. She looked at it for a second, then placed it face down on the wood with a quiet thud. "Old fool," she whispered to the empty room. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the mouse. She wasn't just stealing my money. She was erasing the very memory of me. Then a new character entered the frame, a man I didn't recognize. Tall, wearing a suit that was too shiny, with hair slicked back like a seal. He walked into my study with the casual arrogance of a man who owned the air he breathed. "Who is that?" Frank asked, leaning over my shoulder. "Run his face through the database," I said. Frank's contact in the private security world came through 10 minutes later. "Marcus Sterling, high-risk private lender, connected to the Suarez cartel out of Miami. He doesn't lend money, he buys souls." On the screen, Sterling leaned over Jessica. He touched her shoulder in a way that wasn't affectionate. It was possessive. "The interest is compounding, Jessica," Sterling said, his voice smooth like oil on water. "Every day the old man stays missing instead of dead. The price goes up. My associates are getting impatient. The death certificate is coming." Jessica said, her voice wavering for the first time, "I have Dr. Thorne working on the retrospective diagnosis. It'll be fast-tracked." I watched Michael in the living room. He was a wreck. He was drinking my vintage Highland Park scotch straight from the bottle, his face unshaven and sallow. He looked at the window every few seconds, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. He picked up the phone. I heard the audio through the hidden nursery monitor I'd installed years ago for the grandkids that never came. "I can't sleep. Jess," he sobbed into the receiver. "I see him. I see his face in the window every time the wind blows. The boat, the sound it made when the water hit the engines. Jessica walked into the room. She didn't hug him. She didn't offer comfort. She walked up to him and slapped him. A sharp, ringing crack that echoed through the speakers. "Pull yourself together," she hissed, her face inches from his. "Do you want to go to prison? We did what we had to do." He was suffocating us. Michael. He was a mountain in our way. "Now drink your scotch and shut up. The funeral is in 3 days. After that, we're free." Michael nodded, cowering like a beaten dog. He was a husk, a hollow structure. "We need to know about the doctor," I told Frank. I hacked into Jessica's encrypted emails. I found the thread with a Dr. Ayres Thorne, a disgraced psychiatrist who had lost his license twice for overprescribing. They were paying him $50,000 to write a retrospective diagnosis of advanced dementia and suicidal tendencies. They were rewriting my history to make my murder look like a weary exit. "They're turning me into a crazy old man to cover their tracks," I groaned. "It gets worse, Arthur," Frank said, pointing to a bank transfer he'd intercepted. Jessica had moved another $50,000 to a Lydia Cross, a VP at the bank that managed my trust. Lydia was handing over the offshore account details. Cayman. "Untraceable. Does Michael have access?" I asked. "No," Frank said, scrolling through the documents. "Only Jessica. She's setting up an exit strategy. If Michael cracks, she's gone with the money, and he's left holding the bag." The final blow came that evening. Frank followed Michael to a parking garage downtown. He took photos with a long-range lens. Michael met a fence, a bottom feeder who bought stolen goods. Michael popped the trunk of his car. It was full of my antique maritime map collection. Hand-drawn charts from the 18th century. Items I had spent 40 years scouring the globe for. $5,000 for the lot, the fence said, kicking a 7042 map of the Caribbean. "They're worth 50. Michael whimpered, his hands shaking. "The parchment alone, 5. Take it or leave it. You look like you need a fix, kid. Or a flight." Michael took the cash. He sold my passion for pennies to buy a few hours of silence from his own conscience. I turned off the monitor. The darkness of Frank's basement felt like the bottom of the ocean again. "They're moving fast," Frank said. "The funeral is Friday at the cathedral. Judge Holloway, that corrupt bastard who plays golf at your club, has already agreed to sign the expedited declaration of death during the wake." I stood up. My legs were sore, but the load had shifted. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of the coming collapse. "We have enough to nail them," Frank said, pulling his old service revolver from the cabinet and polishing it. "Let's call the feds. Let's end this." "Not yet," I said. I looked at the image of my son on the screen, selling my maps. I need to give him one last chance to be a man, one chance to confess. If he takes it, I'll spare him the worst of it. "And if he doesn't?" Frank asked. I looked at the black silk tie hanging on the back of the chair. "Then I burn the entire structure to the ground." The letter was written on heavy cream-colored stationery I had kept in Frank's desk, the kind of paper that felt substantial, like a contract. My handwriting was steady, the cursive sharp and precise. "I know what happened on the boat. I saw the valves. I saw the look in your eye. Meet me at the old shipyard, Dock 4, at midnight. Come alone. Confess the truth. And this ends. Ignore this, and the world finds out." I didn't sign it. A ghost doesn't need a signature. Frank slipped the note under the heavy oak front door of my home, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. We sat in the basement, watching the high-definition feed. Michael found it first. He picked it up with trembling fingers, his face turning the color of ash as he read. He dropped the paper as if it were a burning coal. "Jess!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a terror that was almost primal. Jessica swept into the hallway, snatching the note from the floor. She read it once, then twice. Her eyes didn't fill with fear. They narrowed into 2 dark slits of calculation. She wasn't a woman cornered. She was a predator deciding whether to fight or flee. "A witness," she hissed, her voice a low vibration. "Someone saw the boat go down. Someone was watching from the shore. What do we do?" Michael was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his expensive sweater. He grabbed his hair, pacing the foyer. "We have to go to the police. Jess, we have to tell them it was an accident." We can say we panicked. We have to turn ourselves in. No. Jessica grabbed him by the lapels, shaking him with a ferocity that made him stumble. We are not going to prison. We are worth $80 million tonight, Michael. I didn't sink that boat and kill a man just to spend my life in a cell because of some low-life black marker. But they know they want money, Jessica said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. That's all this is. A shakedown. Blackmail. So we pay them? No, Jessica said. She walked to the side table in the hallway, the one where I used to keep my car keys. She opened the drawer and pulled out a heavy, matte black object. It was my gun, a Bort .38 Special. I had kept for 30 years. She shoved the cold steel into Michael's shaking hands. We silence them, she said. Go to the shipyard. If they ask for money, you shoot them. It's them or us, Michael. Choose. Michael looked at the gun. He looked at the woman he had sacrificed his soul for. He could have dropped it. He could have walked out into the night and found a priest or a cop. Instead, he nodded. He checked the chamber, his movements clumsy but deliberate. Okay, he whispered. I turned off the monitor. The silence in Frank's basement was heavier than the ocean. Call her, I said to Frank. Agent Miller? Yes, tell her the stage is set. Agent Sarah Miller arrived 20 minutes later. She was a veteran of the FBI's white-collar and violent crime divisions, a woman who saw the world in terms of evidence and intent. She listened to the recordings we had made. She watched the video of Michael accepting the weapon. We can take them tonight, Arthur, Miller said, her hand resting on her own holster. Conspiracy, attempted murder, weapons charges. We have enough. No, I said, standing up. I felt a strange, cold energy humming in my limbs. They wanted a show. They wanted the grieving widow and the tragic heir to inherit the kingdom. I'm going to give them the ending they deserve. The day of the funeral was a masterpiece of atmospheric gloom. A relentless cold rain fell over the city, turning the streets into rivers of gray slate. St. Jude's Cathedral loomed out of the mist, its Gothic spires reaching upward like frozen screams. I had paid for the renovation of the nave 10 years ago. I knew every acoustic sweet spot in that building. The church was packed. The pews were filled with the who's who of the logistics world, senators I had lobbied, rivals I had outmaneuvered, and employees who had worked for me for decades. They were all there to bury the Titan Advanced Logistics. I waited in the sacristy, hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains. With me was Agent Miller and a tactical team, their black gear a sharp contrast to the ornate gold of the altar. You sure about this, Arthur? Miller whispered. This is high theater. It's a structural necessity, I replied. To destroy a lie this big, you have to expose the foundation in front of everyone. Through the crack in the door, I watched the service. Jessica was at the podium, her performance worthy of a standing ovation. She wore a veil of black lace that partially obscured her face, her voice trembling with a perfectly rehearsed grief. Arthur was a force of nature, she said to the weeping crowd. He was a man of steel, yes, but he loved us. He was a father to me when mine was gone. We tried to save him. On that boat, oh God, the waves. We tried so hard. She broke down into a series of soft, rhythmic sobs. The crowd murmured in sympathy, handkerchiefs appearing like white flags across the pews. Then Michael took the podium, and he looked like a ghost himself, hollowed out, his eyes darting toward the exits. My father, he stopped, swallowing hard. He taught me everything. He was the sun we all orbited. I hope he's at peace now. We will honor his memory by taking Advanced Logistics into a new era, by protecting the legacy he built with his bare hands. Liar, I whispered, the word lost in the vastness of the cathedral. That was the cue. I nodded to Rank, who was positioned in the sound booth at the back of the church. He hit the master over it. The lights in the cathedral flickered, buzzed, and died. The massive, vaulted room was plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. Gasps rippled through the pews. A few people cried out. Then the audio started. Frank had hooked the cloud backup from the ironclad into the cathedral's multi-million-dollar PA system. Thunk! The sound of the Seacocks opening boomed through the stone walls, like a thunderclap. It was a physical sound, a vibration that shook the prayer books in the racks. The bilge pumps are disabled, Arthur. Jessica's voice filled the room, not the trembling voice of the widow, but the cold, clinical voice of the executioner. No one will ever find you. It's a tragedy. Goodbye, Arthur. The silence that followed was more deafening than the audio. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath. Then a single blinding white spotlight hit the center aisle. I stepped out from behind the curtain. I walked slowly, my black shoes clicking against the marble floor with the steady, inexorable rhythm of a heartbeat. Clack, clack, clack. I walked past the mourners, past the rivals, past the people who thought they were at my wake. I reached the altar. Michael saw me first. He dropped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the air like a dying animal. He staggered back, his heels catching on the edge of my empty, open casket. He slid to the floor, his face draining of color until he looked like the wax figures in a museum. Dad? He choked out. Jessica froze. She didn't fall. She stood at the podium, her eyes bulging, her mouth opening and closing in a silent, jagged okay. The realization hit her like a high-speed collision. The boat, the escape, the letter, the recording. It was the total collapse of her world. I picked up the microphone. My voice, amplified and steady, filled every corner of the sanctuary. "Hello, Michael," I said. "Hello, Jessica." Jessica stammered, her voice a shrill, desperate rasp. "You're dead. We saw the boat go under. You couldn't." "I built that boat, Jessica," I said, stepping closer to her. "I knew where the air was. I knew how the steel would hold. You forgot that I understand how things work. You only understood how to take." I turned to the stunned audience. My daughter-in-law opened the valves of the ironclad and locked me in the belly of the ship to drown. My son, my only son. He stood by and watched the water rise. "He's lying," Jessica shrieked, her mask finally shattering. She lunged toward the crowd, pointing a shaking finger. "He's senile. He's had a breakdown. He's been hiding in the woods. Arrest him." "And last night," I continued, my voice drowning her out, "I gave Michael a choice. I gave him a chance to confess. Instead, he took my gun to a shipyard to murder a witness. Is the gun still in your pocket, Michael? Or did you drop it in the car?" "Federal agents." Agent Miller's voice boomed as the tactical team swarmed the altar. Jessica bolted. She ran for the choir exit, shoving an elderly priest aside with a desperate, animalistic strength. She didn't get 5 feet before 2 agents tackled her into the marble. She screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated rage. "It's my money," she howled as the cuffs clicked shut. "You old bastard, I earned it. I put up with you for 10 years. It's mine." They cuffed Michael where he sat. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He just curled into a ball next to the empty coffin and wept. As they dragged him past me, he looked up, his eyes red and pleading. "Dad, please, help me." She made me do it. I looked down at the stranger who shared my DNA. I felt a phantom pain in my chest, the ghost of the love I once had, but it was a distant thing, like the memory of a house that had burned down ago. "I gave you the letter, Michael," I said softly. "I gave you a path out of the dark. You chose the gun. You chose the darkers. The trial was a media circus, but the evidence was an engineered fortress. The audio recordings, the security footage from Frank's basement, and the ballistic match on the gun were irrefutable. Jessica was sentenced to 30 years. She never looked at me during the proceedings. She sat like a statue, cold and empty, already calculating her next move in a world that would never be hers again. Michael got 15 years. His plea for leniency was rejected. The judge cited the absolute betrayal of the most basic human bond. 6 months later, I visited him. The prison was a world of gray concrete and fluorescent lights, the antithesis of the ocean. We sat on opposite sides of the reinforced glass. Michael looked thinner, the softness of his old life replaced by a hollow, jittery despair. "How is the company, Dad?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "I sold it," I said. His eyes went wide, his hands pressing against the glass. "What?" "That was the legacy. That was for the family. You can't just sell it." "I redefined the family." "Michael," I said, my voice calm and clear. I put every cent from the sale, $200 million, into a trust, the Vance Foundation. We don't build warehouses anymore. We build trade schools. We find kids who have been discarded by the system, kids who want to learn to weld, to plumb, to frame a house. We give them the tools to build a life from scratch. Michael put his head in his hands. So I have nothing. When I get out, I'm just a felon with nothing. You have a trade school, I said. There is a campus in this state. When you get out, if you want to learn to be a man who works with his hands, there is a spot for you. You can start at the bottom. You can see if you have the strength to carry a load you actually earned. I stood up to leave. Dad, he whispered. I paused at the heavy steel door. Do you still love me? I looked at him through the glass. I wanted to lie. I wanted to give him a comfort I didn't feel. But I was Arthur Vance. I only dealt in the truth of the structure. I love the memory of the boy you were, I said. The boy who used to help me change the oil in the trucks. But that boy died on the ironclad. I'm still looking for the man who's supposed to take his place. I walked out into the sunlight. Frank was waiting in the tuck, the engine idling with a familiar steady hum. The sky was blue and vast, the air smelling of pine and the distant salt tang of the Atlantic. You okay, boss? Frank asked, putting the truck into gear. I'm okay, Frank. I was 71 years old. I was alone, my house was empty, and my name was no longer on a fleet of trucks. But as we drove down the highway past the construction sites and the rising skeletons of new buildings, I felt the vibration of potential. I was a builder. And I had a lot of work to do. Thanks for walking this journey with us all the way. With Arthur and Michael in mind, was this ending how it should have happened, or something else? Let us know in the comments.